We're going to do a mic check, so relax, family, okay? Thank you. We're not on the telephone. Go ahead, Nellie.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Okay, Sam, go ahead, try.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
All right, there we go. We're on. Go, Nellie.
Hello, everyone. We are a little late starting today, but welcome to Behind the News for Liberation and Political Consciousness, right here in the studios of GHCR.NYC. Before we begin the program, I wish to state that the views expressed in this program does not reflect the views nor thoughts of the management, nor the housing, nor the Tenants Council of Grant Houses. And again, we welcome you to the program. We're a little late getting started, but we have a special guest here in the studio, Samuel White Jr., who's a longtime Harlem activist and who is the founder of the Leadership Committee for Uptown Housing Activists. And later on in the program, we're going to bring on Tom Syracuse, who is another longtime activist on the Upper West Side, and he's head of a group of that advocates for the rights of rent-controlled tenants. So we're going to start the program off with Samuel White Jr., confusing him with another activist, Samuel White Jr., who is here in the studios with us. Sam, welcome to the program, and I hope you don't mind me calling you Sam throughout the program.
That is fine. Thank you very much, Nellie. I'm very glad to be here. I just want to, just to be clear that I'm part of a leadership, though the founder, part of a leadership committee that kind of runs and being involved with the Uptown Tenant Advocacy, and our base is at the Mount Morris Ascension Presbyterian Church, and it is all part of our belief that the bases of community activism should be in the churches in the community as well as NYCHA buildings.
Right. Well, that was going to be my first question to you, to explain to our listeners the committee, its history. How was it founded? Was it a group of tenant activists coming together? And I wish to express, the same as you did, that it's important that this committee, this organization, is based in the churches because so many churches here in Harlem have been demolished, sold, and it is not very often that we run into or hear about an activist church. So talk about this a little bit more in terms of the role of the church and how you first became involved with the church, you and other advocates.
Yeah, well, certainly one of the things that people who are involved in activities and concerns in Harlem is you're usually looking for space, somewhere that you can meet, get work done, etc. And when the concern is there, but you just don't have money to do it, don't even have a budget sometimes, you cannot go and rent space in the state office building, for example. Everybody wants something, some monies. However, if you can utilize and get to know many people in the various churches in Harlem. Churches, by the way, that memberships are in decline. Folks don't go to church too much anymore, and many of the churches are kind of holding on with aging membership, and dying membership too. The feeling is that we will have to go back to the earliest days of, I guess, the last century and even before, in which the church provided many services other than the spiritual for its congregation. And you hear stories of there being food co-ops and selling of food and clothing. And administering to the needs of the various needs of community people. And the church must go back to that, because what you have, and oftentimes, especially the bigger churches, is that folks are kind of moved out of the area, come into the church from someplace else. The church cannot quite make up its maintenance to keep the church going on. Nothing really happens there between Sunday to Sunday. So that sets up a situation in the current era, the gentrification era in Harlem, in which you have any morning, noon, and nighttime. And I'm telling you, in the nighttime, people are walking through the neighborhood with maps under their arms, looking at property, taking pictures on their phone, looking at property, while many of us are asleep. Even in the daytime, going through.
What do you mean looking at properties?
Looking at property,
properties to purchase, to buy.
Yes. And many churches are very susceptible, especially if you have churches that are not running a more democratic kind of way. It's all about the preacher. Let him run the situation, and we'll just accept what happens. And you find that up and down the line, the pastors make these deals with developers, and the church is suddenly gone. I mean, you cannot find, and many, big and small, churches just go, and they disappear.
Yeah, well, let's deal with some specific examples for, and starting with Church of the Masters, which has been demolished.
Yeah.
And is now a luxury apartment building.
Yes.
And we have the church on Fifth Avenue, and you remember that church, which was sold to an individual, which is now his private home.
Yes, that's the one in the middle of the box. I think it's Mount Moriah.
Mount Moriah, it is.
And it had, and in an effort that was being made to try to come out of that isolation, because it's a huge place with not membership. I remember going by there, and that's where the lady who was in her 90s would make food, Thanksgiving dinners for people in the community coming and eating. Well, she did that for quite some time, because she didn't have a real space on the street and in the churches. Well, that was taken over by a pastor who made the deal, and he subsequently died very shortly after that. There was an additional church, the same size, on the corner to the north of that. That was sold.
On the corner of what? What are you
127th Street and Fifth Avenue. Mm-hmm. And that was sold also, and that's now a huge condominium-type building. Mm-hmm. Two right together. And before they sold, though, one of their means of income were to have these tourist buses that would come in, and they would line up around the corner and go into the churches. So the last couple of efforts that was made by this elderly lady to do these dinners in the church, and there was a veterans group that was trying to form in there, it just didn't go off. Because, again, the pastor assumed leadership, the membership didn't really care, and what happened, and he just
I don't think it's a case of, in many instances, it's not the case of the membership not caring. It's the case of the membership not knowing.
Oh, yeah.
It's the case of the membership being kept, I hate to say in the dark, because it's the case of the membership deliberately being excluded from the financial affairs of the church. Mm-hmm. And you have this cabal within the church that are not looking out for the membership, but rather for their personal enrichment. And that's part of the problem. But it is not only here in Harlem, but it is throughout the city, where churches are being sold, libraries are being sold and demolished. It is a wave of corruption and development that goes hand in hand with the elected officials and the political institutions in this city that are driving this gentrification agenda, which really is public policy. That's what it is, folks. It is public policy. And when Sam referred earlier to the outreach and the commitment of the church to the community, you can think about days like Daddy Grace, who had churches all over, and they would feed people and they would try to house people. And of course, I'm not trying to suggest that the conditions that existed then are the same as the conditions today, because clearly it is not. We have escalating real estate taxes. We have the price of oil that has shot up, which is why most of these churches, just to give them credit, don't have their doors open because, particularly in the wintertime, because they can't afford the oil bill to pay for the oil. But on the other hand, if they were an activist institution, they would bring in a membership that would help to stabilize their financial difficulties. What do you think about that?
Yes, certainly. And it's a large part of it is that you have these declining memberships, and it kind of goes across Harlem, is that there is vital information that people must have at their fingertips and want to have the information. So in dealing with the people who come into their churches or scouring the neighborhoods at night looking to pick up property, they will have a means of understanding what's going on and be able to fight these people and to let them know that you're not dealing with stupid people, or letting their pastors know that we are a part of this. This is our situation. It's not just you, it is us. But many defer to the pastor, and so you see strange things happening, like with the church on 135th Street and Lenox Avenue, Malcolm X Boulevard, that's been on the corner for many, many years. No, it's kind of into the block, actually. And it was sold, but you see that the deal was made...
The church on 135th?
Right, across from Harlem Hospital.
Yeah, right. Because at one time, there was a woman pastor
Yeah, still is.
in
Still
that
is.
church, and there were a number that pastor was progressive and who brought in some progressive forums and programs. Are you saying that church is now sold?
Yeah, we even did a program there, a housing situation there a while back. Before then, but what it is you see, and just reading around, I haven't sat down with her since, but she will get a living quarters in the new property after the church is torn down and this huge thing rises up the street. Now a
luxury development.
Yeah,
what is this huge
thing?
You're talking about?
Well, it was $10 million the sale of the church, and then she will get a space inside that facility housing once it goes up. Now
is it just a second so our listeners will understand? She will get an apartment.
An apartment in there.
So
building, yeah.
the sale of the church that was for $10 million. Where did those funds go to? Was it?
Oh, it was.
What happened?
Yeah. In that same year, a developer, I don't remember his name at this point, but he was considered to be a billionaire from an Asian, and his son's a millionaire. It's just only a millionaire, but he bought that. He paying for, according to what we read, relocation monies were aside so that when they relocate to the church can go somewhere while the development goes on in the place, which will rise up. And in the meantime, he bought two other churches along the strip, going from 123rd Street uptown. So in the same year, the same developer bought that particular Metropolitan AME. He bought one on 133rd in the middle of a block, a smaller church, and that made the news because in locking up the church and going in and doing development, rats flooded the block between Lenox, Malcolm X, and Adam Clayton Powell. Then there was one around the corner from the Atla, which everybody is familiar with the sign on 123rd.
He bought that church?
Not Atla, but there's a church going into the block, also pastored by a sister, and that has been sold too by the same person.
Oh, okay. So the church that is across from Harlem Hospital, what's the name of that church?
Metropolitan AME.
Okay.
By the way, which is not to be confused with Metropolitan Methodist, which has also been sold on 126th Street and Madison Avenue. And we've had some
Yes.
programs there.
Okay. Okay.
Big and
All
small,
right.
they're
This
going.
is, well, we're going to continue this discussion with with Samuel White Jr. I don't know why that is sticking in my brain.
his
Please
birthday.
forgive me. With Samuel White Jr., and he's going to come back. He's agreed to come back and talk with us, and we're going to have the specifics of these, the sale, and who the developer is, and this raid on the purchase buyout of institutions in Harlem, and in particular churches, because churches really made up not only a housing stock, because remember, some of these churches, like the Abyssinian Baptist Church, had a development arm, and even that has been in trouble, as it was with Abyssinian Baptist Church. Which has sold off most of its ownership properties in its housing portfolio. They're building right across from the Harlem YMCA was sold, of all places, in an auction. And so not only do we have, when you look at the raid on the churches, and when you just look up these outside forces just gobbling up real estate, it's no wonder that Central Harlem has lost a population of over 100,000 people in the past 10 years. Can you talk about that a little bit, how it drives up the migration out of New York City? The New York Times has reported on this, the loss of population, and it's not only because we. Now let me pause for a moment. Let's put all of this together. We have public schools that are closed or turned into charter schools. That's part of our institutional development and black leadership that was once fostered here in Harlem, as it has been in other cities that has a large concentration of black residents. The schools have been privatized. Churches are sold. Real estate taxes, if there were any private home ownership, as was the case in Detroit, Michigan, and it was so fraudulent that the state legislature had to intervene, as it was in Washington, D.C., that the Washington Post did a series of articles on, and how the theft of these properties, really deed theft, was in collaboration with black city officials. We now have this situation here throughout New York City and Brooklyn and in Harlem mostly, that the radio personality Bob Law has done a series of workshops and forums on about deed theft and the loss of black home ownership. So when you look at and combine all of these different trends, you have, in my opinion, an orchestrated effort to get rid of black working class and home ownership, even middle class home ownership, in these municipalities that were once a stronghold of black population. So you are, one, diluting the political power of blacks in these municipalities. And could you comment on this or give us your thoughts?
Wowee, it's a lot of stuff, but it's good. Let me see here. You mentioned this is a particular concern of mine, and it basically took place in Brooklyn, the working class community in Brooklyn, and you mentioned Bob Law had the program there. Well, there has been, going in from end of last year, a most extraordinary series that was done again, it was a small time, just like the radio station, a small digital newspaper, the Kings County Politico. And with out of 30 articles over the last few months, some coming out twice a week, two writers who ought to get all kinds of awards covered this story. Walking around in the streets, talking to people, et cetera, getting the real story, which wasn't. In fact, I got information about this from Connecticut end of last year, and these pieces put together by this two reporters looked at the situation to the degree that the city, in collaboration with for-profit and largely not-for-profit agencies, was actually ripping off the homes of older black people who had put years and years of work into these properties, paid off the bills, and was deciding that, and many times the city's records were just fraudulent, were taking properties from these elderly people. And
mostly elderly black homeowners.
That's very clear. In fact, and even
that was the target.
Yeah, and there was even a couple of they probably found there was a Hispanic HDFC and a largely black HDFC that found belatedly that they were not living, that those properties were not theirs. Forget about the equity that had been put into these properties. The city was on a roll. And one of the pieces that was done by the Kings County Politico indicated how the city, the mayor, stood back on his haunches. And
we should say what mayor we were talking about. That's Mayor Bill de Blasio. Just to be on target here.
And had said that this is our program, third-party transfer, and we're going to run this the way we want to run it. And these people failed, and he's ready to turn them over to friendly not-for-profit agencies, and they're all set up to receive it. However, I think and I remember going through the elections, for the Attorney General election, there was efforts made to kind of pull together all the parts, and the current lieutenant, she was a public advocate then, but the current Attorney General had kind of indicated, Letitia James, and her thing going to election was, when it seemed to be very critical, we will, this is something to be examined, but it was never any kind of push from the entire political establishment in Brooklyn. They all kind of came into the game belatedly, to the degree that I'll say right now, I want to go on and on and on.
No, please.
Yeah, that they were kind of cautious. Remember efforts being made to ask them, could you hold a hearing? Could you have a community meeting? Could we do this? But in many instances, these older homeowners were fought back. Their family pulled together and they did some running. They found a friendly attorney here or there. But it was basically the older people there running the show. And it was all reported by this little digital paper in Kings County. However, now you see that there have been meetings going on in the city councils, there's a meeting, and the Bob Laws have the meeting, et cetera, et cetera. And that's all good. But I think...
But it really doesn't accomplish very much. I attended one of them, and it provided space for people to vent, and rather dramatically, I might add, but there was little, if any, resolution about this. The politicians promised that they would look into it, blah, 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 but that was about the size of it. Let's back up a little bit for our listeners who are not aware of the third-party transfer program. This program was initiated under the Giuliani, Mayor Rudolph Giuliani. We know him. He's Donald Trump's lawyer now, President Trump's lawyer now. And that was when Deborah Wright was the head of HPD. You do remember that, right, Sam?
Yes, indeed.
Who later on became the CEO of Carver Bank, where she went on to approve $10 million in construction-related loans, most of which were defaulted on, and the black shareholders lost everything. Carver used to be one of the major black-owned banks, which is no longer the case. It is owned by Wall Street, and that's who came in with the bailout. Miss Wright soon left, and there was no expose on that travesty at all. Anyway, getting back to the third-party transfer program. Harlem at one time, the city rather, owned at one time in about almost 70% of the housing stock in New York City. I used to think it was 60%, but someone said, no, Nellie, it was 70%, but I always read that it was 60%. And so the city decided, and this was at the heyday of abandonment and really planned shrinkage. How many of you listeners know about planned shrinkage that was instituted under the A. Beam administration when Roger Starr was head of the housing commissioner at the time? And do you know what Mr. Starr said? He said, and it caused quite a scandal, he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, blacks and Latinos should leave the city because the city no longer could provide industrialized jobs here. There were no jobs. And why don't you people just get out of the city? And it was under Roger Starr that the city instituted planned shrinkage. And you know what that means? Shrinkage of vital services to a community. Less garbage picked up, less police presence. I mean, just in terms of the minimum amount, I mean, some work that they do besides just killing us. They cut out subway stations. They really shrunk municipal services to Harlem and the South Bronx. Now, they didn't want to burn Harlem down as the landlords did in the Bronx because they did it for the insurance money. And remember Howard Cosell at that infamous baseball game, and he looked out and he said, "The Bronx is burning." Well, the Bronx was burning not because the people were setting fires, but it was the landlords who were collecting the insurance money. That's what that was. So here in Harlem, the landlord milked, meaning taking all of the profits out of the building until there was nothing left to milk the property of, and then they abandoned the property. So therefore, and then that's when the city stepped in and said, we can't take on this. And I mean, there were some advocacy, like from the likes of Samuel White Jr. to say, and that was at the beginning of the sweat equity programs, which grew into the, what was it that, Sam, could you bring us through this history? I'll stop here and let you finish it up. Yeah. Just in terms of the sweat equity and how that led to the tenant interim lease program. And I'm trying to think of the HPD official who, Tony Glideman was one of them, I think.
Yeah.
Can you bring us up to date?
Yeah, I
that?
I remember that. I'm looking at one particular organization, religious community organization, that had been promised with their sweat equity they could take over and utilize this particular building in Harlem. And there were other examples, but I remember that the group really, and there was at that time they were promised some of these special city workers. I can't think of the name of it, going back into the 70s, that they were going to workers working for the city would come in and provide some resources and help them, and they were going to get some monies available to fix up. And then what happened was there was some problem with the money. So many of the people took the city at its word, and they gave up their apartments and they moved into these partially crumbling buildings, and they were going to get the resources to construct. They were going to do a lot of work themselves. Doing some of the work themselves, and many of them came out of that thing, became members of unions, the construction unions, but they had a series of buildings wrapped around the corner of 113th Street and St. Nicholas, and they lived in these buildings, and the resources were just not available. And looking back at an earlier time, you don't find certain kind of actions taking place nowadays. One of the members, I'm not going to mention the group's name, one of the members went down to City Hall and held the entire package of people who were supposedly funding and overseeing and making sure they would have good homes out of these buildings that were crumbling, and held them all hostage at gunpoint. And of course, the particular individual made the sacrifice, but when they saw the intent and the concern of all these families had given up their apartments to pool their monies to live in this building, the money began to flow again. It took that kind of action. Of course, the particular gentleman who did it had to pay for it that way, but the structure was ultimately built. And now, as you can see on that particular
what building or what neighborhood are you
I'm talking about
Harlem,
Harlem, 113th Street, St. Nicholas Avenue, the Mosque of Islamic Brotherhood.
Okay.
And so that they have several buildings wrapped around the corner, which they still own to this very day. And many of the members have gone on maybe elsewhere, but they're filled up with and they run the property, they own the property. And that's what the thought was it should have done. And then there was a TIL program, which is supposed to work.
The TIL program is the Tenant Interim Lease Program that allowed these city-owned buildings taken over by the residents of that building to go into a training program for you learn how to manage your property. You had to take classes, and then the group of the building would graduate into a cooperative ownership program. And when the program was first initiated, the tenant in the building could purchase their unit for $250. That was the beginning of the HDFC cooperatives. And we can go on from there as to its current state. But please continue.
But certainly, fast forward, that was when a lot of the property was abandoned, and there was properties all up and down the street that were locked doors and garbage in the backyard, and nobody really wanted to be. But the people who held on to it, especially those who entered the TIL program, maintained these properties. Of course, they were supposed to be trained, and millions of dollars went to a number of agencies that trained.
Well, let's be very clear. Most of the money went to UHAB, the Urban Homestead Assistance Program.
Yeah, we'll get to that exactly, because there were several. There were several. I remember going to some of those meetings, and there were several
but they
groups.
got the biggest contract.
Exactly.
That's the point.
And they were the ones that rose above the pack, and there were others kind of died away. So it became all of UHABs. However,
right.
and
plus with UHAB, let's be very clear, there were no blacks in the leadership of the organization now and not today.
Yeah, well, certainly, if you remember the meeting they had on one of the last meetings of that Keith Wright had around the tenant-owned cooperatives in Harlem.
It was so pathetic.
It was pathetic, and the only one that they could find to come forward and talk about it, they brought her there first, was a black woman who had been only employed there for a couple of months, and it was all above her head, so they had to bring in some of the older people who were with her,
Who,
of
who
another.
was the woman whom they brought in?
I don't remember her name, but she was a school chum of Keith Wright, who chaired the committee. He brought her over, but she was totally out of her depth. So that the leadership who was there at the beginning, almost at the beginning to the end, came forward with some other people of his ethnic group, and they talked. They gave their part about you having they say it had done, trained people, but it hadn't done the training. And the people in these buildings...
Or they did a poor... It was a poorly executed training. It wasn't anything. And just to throw in this, so people can really understand where we're headed with this in terms of these support services to train tenants for management and for ownership, meeting their fiduciary responsibilities as a co-op, was this organization called UHAB, which later on, when Letitia James, who is now the Attorney General of New York State, when she held the position of Public Advocate of New York City, she named UHAB in her list of worst landlords.
Exactly. And certainly, Nellie, as the poor training, I think that's what I'm to say, the inattention to
and
a lot of the buildings.
And that's mankind.
Yes. And because my feeling is that these buildings were supposed to be placeholders, keep things in place. If people abandoned them, ran away from them, they would be vandalized, etc. So you keep them in place, present the spirit that we're going to, you'll be owning these properties one day, and there was a lot that was not done. You began to see that as the community's value improved, UHAB morphed in, as a training agency, morphed into SHUHAB, a development agency, which consisted of UHAB, the settlement houses. There's a legal group attached to it. And they became, as one end was probably helping, the other end was just grabbing the properties. And those were the groups, development agency, SHUHAB, which is responsible and involved with a lot of the buildings that didn't quite make it. We will make them work.
Okay, now let's double back to the third-party transfer program, which you introduced in the conversation. So the third-party transfer program, as it has now been initiated under the Bill de Blasio administration. Remember earlier we said that this was a program, TPT, that was initiated under Giuliani, who is now, again, the attorney for President Donald Trump.
Yeah.
But it is now under the de Blasio administration, who has promised in his mayoral administration, that he has promised to build or to create 200,000 units of affordable housing. So where is he going to get this? And so the third-party transfer program under this so-called liberal mayor is now being used to give these buildings back to developers and landlords. And that is the short, and that is the short story in all of this. And that's why that program that was initiated under Mayor Giuliani is now relevant today, because it is returning these buildings, in particular these HDFCs, some whom have been poorly managed. There is definitely a problem of internal corruption, because these people who stayed, they stayed the course. There is no doubt about it. They stayed through planned shrinkage. When planned shrinkage was all about driving black people out of Harlem. We're talking about Harlem now. I'm not talking about the Bronx, as well as the Bronx itself. And that because this was planned abandonment. This is not accidental. It's not about, oh, these white people are moving in. Yes, that's true. But this is part of government policy and planning to take over municipalities where blacks were once had a large concentration, where blacks were the majority population. Now, this is not conspiracy. Just look at the facts. Just look at the coverage. Just read the New York Times. Go over some of those articles. And why are so many black cities losing? Why are so many cities that were predominantly black losing its population, whether it is in Chicago, which is a good example because they tore down public housing, whether it is in D.C., Chocolate City, even though it is not a state, it has a colonial status. The same thing in Atlanta, Portland, Oregon, L.A., where you find many blacks have lost their homes. Danny Glover and his partner just did a film on the black man who lost. You remember that film, Sam?
I don't know.
The black man who lost his home or something like that. It was about L.A., the Haight-Ashbury district. When we even before this, when we look at Georgetown in D.C. How many of us knew that Georgetown was once a predominantly black community? Did you know that? Not anymore. Not anymore. And when we look at the shrinking population here in Harlem, Central Harlem has held out for the most part, but that's going very fast. And you look at the dilution of black political control. I don't understand why the black politicians in Harlem don't understand that once you go along with all of these developers, you are shrinking your black voting base, and they themselves will no longer be in power. I don't understand why they don't get that. I don't understand why it is that they can corporatize 125th Street, but there are no unions, and you have part-time jobs, no health insurance. This is why in some quarters these folks are called the Black Misleadership class. And the question before all of us is, what are we going to do about it? Go ahead, Sam.
Well, certainly it's we have such a pathetic leadership here, and I'm just recalling them sharing a float last week, 1 week after the African American Day Parade, and you have what is regarded as the current leadership, although Wranglers people were a part of the parade somewhat. They weren't on this particular float, but these four heads, Brian Benjamin, the state senator, one.
Who has announced his run for controller.
Exactly right. The 22nd, he began to run out and get his papers together. And so it's a career situation to move up and up. And he did come from a real estate background. He was at Harvard Business School, something like that. Mm-hmm. But so, anyway, and then there was...
he rose in the ranks by his appointment to the community board. That is a political process that our listeners need to understand, which is why you, our listeners, you need to become involved in your local community boards.
Exactly. And certainly, even after the situation described in great detail in a little newspaper, and now it's all digital, the selection process of him deciding downtown as he will be the person who will be selected to be the next. It wasn't about us up here. It's about downtown, the decision being made that we'll choose Brian Benjamin. But I think that, let me see, there's a couple of things. Oh, there's so much here. That there are buildings in the community that ought to be looked at that are kind of falling between the cracks. that are city-owned, that are still occupied to a great degree, that ought to be looked at. And I think it's where the next level for those who care and those who have the energy and those who want and think we should be affordable housing, to not necessarily wait on what the city will provide or the lottery that comes up every now and then, but to look at those buildings that are still owned by the city. These are not private entities. The buildings have been kept open. The buildings have supers. The buildings are kept warm. The buildings are repaired. These are city-owned buildings that are in a section of HPD, and if that would seem to be our last area of struggle, and we could raise some issues in regards to these buildings that are partially filled, many that have operating functionally. We should be demanding this is affordable housing that folks should be fighting for. And I remember at one time a while ago looking, and within a walking distance of where a lot of us sit and eat and discuss things like this most evenings, Whole Foods, that about a dozen buildings, and they're city-owned and they're partially filled. And fortunately, one of them is a good friend who was one of the, she's an elderly lady, and she used to serve food in front of the building. She was trying to get the vacant restaurant just below her apartment. However, she went to the hospital. She's in a nursing home now, and she hoped to come back to her home. However, in the meantime, the city told us that it was going to be renovated, and now that everybody's out, I passed by there the other day, and every single window has been boarded up. Mm-hmm. So she's never coming back to that particular building at the age of 99. We think not. But they had informed us that the tenants who were there, again, it was a partially occupied building, city-owned building on 130th Street. We were going to renovate it, and we will put the tenants elsewhere, and they'll all come back to their homes.
Now, that is really, really a scam. Now, I used to work for a church that had a development arm. And, Doug, do we have a call? Not yet. Pardon me? That I used to work for a non-for-profit here in Central Harlem that had a development arm. And one of the biggest scams going with HPD was the rehab of a building. And they would come up with various reasons. I mean, whatever, they're going to make more units, they're going to, which means making the apartments smaller. But according to federal guidelines, if they did a relocation, they had to promise the tenant that they could return, and that was part of the deal. But oftentimes, the redevelopment of the property could take up to 2 years or more. And by that time, people had settled in with the new neighborhood. Some wanted to come back, some didn't. Some didn't want to come back when they saw that the unit was smaller. And these subsidies, these relocation subsidies, were paid for by HPD. And so those buildings were quickly turned over to these private landlords and development. It was no longer a Section 8. And remember, that's something else we should talk about, because most of these landlords are not accepting Section 8, which is against the law, because it's discrimination. But let us continue in terms of now, Sam, bring us up to date. What are the typical, sort of, not, I won't say cases or complaints that you hear about from tenants who are under threat of eviction or who under threat of eviction and being turned out? I know, you have, I've attended your meetings, and some of these large developments, they have targeted seniors. Some shall remain unnamed, but they have targeted seniors, and supposedly they have a waiting list from two decades ago. But the people who are coming in are of another ethnicity, and you know darn well they were not on the waiting list as were other folks a decade or so ago.
I think that one of the things that, and none of this stuff involves going to the usual housing meetings in which folks go, as you said, vent, but you don't get an understanding as to the simple process of finding out who's your landlord, and many people don't. It's a very simple process. You do it on your phone, simply enough. But it's something.
Sam, take us through that process for people who are listening. What is that process?
You want to find out where who's the landlord. You Google in NYC HPD, and up pops the Housing Preservation and Development site, and you want to plug in the address of your building or whoever else's building you're looking at, and you give you the borough, the address, usually the numbers, and then you get the street on another line. Plug that all in, and it takes you right to the owner, the management agency.
Yeah, but it's important to say to people, be sure to note the block and lot number, because that will be your research guide. Your address, the address of the building, and the block and lot number. Please continue.
But in terms of looking at the NYC HPD, just Google it in. It will, if you put in the address, and it'll take your next step will come up, and at the very top of the screen would be the block and the lot and the units and the A and B and that kind of stuff, along with the violations, et cetera, which is a very useful tool in terms of struggling with these folks, because you can have all kind of things happening if you just observe some things that are not quite right in your building and let the city know and bring the inspector out and make a case out of it.
Go ahead, Sam.
And sometimes folks just don't do that. They let it pass, let it go by. And you should know, people should know if they're uncomfortable. And I know the situation, buildings that remain open, if they have let the city know that they are not quite happy with what's going on in their building, whoever it is.
Right.
So that you can find there, whether it's a city-owned building or it's a privately owned building. And if you get in your hands the violations there, they're all recorded. They'll tell you the apartment it came from, or it's a general hall area.
Right.
And one of the reasons why one of the tenants in one of the buildings we work with is still there after 10 years. They began to move them out 10 years ago. Everybody's gone. Almost everybody's gone.
Yeah, right, and they will keep them out of the building. Yeah. Now we're going to switch. We're going to switch gears here a little bit, because we now have on the line longtime housing activist Tom Syracuse, who has been involved in this for a very long time. And Tom, welcome to the program. Hello, Tom.
Hello.
Yes, welcome to the program, Tom.
Thank you.
Yeah. Now, Tom, we're going to switch gears here a little bit, because I want you to talk about the rent regulations that were passed by the New York State Legislature. I want you to give us a synopsis of that legislation. Hello? Hello? I don't think we have a connection. Tom, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Yes. Tom,
Okay.
did you hear my question?
Thank you very much for calling me. As you know, I'm the chair of the Committee to Protect Rent Control.
Yes.
Now, I believe that these recent rent reform laws do not really address the housing crisis here in New York City.
Well, that's a mouthful, and
Although
correctly.
these reforms are steps in the right direction, they do eliminate vacancy decontrol.
Now, what,
And
Tom?
they,
Tom, before you,
they
Tom,
make,
Tom,
rent regulations. Hello?
Tom, before you go on, tell our listeners what is vacancy decontrol, okay? Give us an explanation.
What they am I coming through clearly?
Yes, you are. If you could answer that.
Okay. So as I was saying, yes, there are certain reforms. It eliminates vacancy decontrol. That's a big step forward, and they also make preferential rents permanent for those people who are already on it, and but however, they have the problem is that many people and renters in New York pay more than 50% of their incomes toward rent, and they cannot afford more increases, and this includes those people who are on SCREE and DREE, those rent freeze programs, because those programs are not retroactive to a third of their rent, and there is no bill to build publicly funded housing for those who do not live in regulated apartments and cannot pay market rate rents. And I hope that there's going to be some effective enforcement to prevent landlords from illegally deregulating vacated rent-regulated apartments. But will there be sufficient funding and enforcement? New York City, passed a bill in 2017 to give free legal counsel to renters who cannot afford their own lawyers in housing court, but so far has failed to fund the program. One of the things that I'm particularly against is Mayor de Blasio's mandatory inclusionary housing and zoning program, and also Governor Cuomo's 421A billion-dollar tax exemption to big developers who put up high-rise luxury buildings. I believe that these programs are a major cause of gentrification. This inclusionary housing is supposed to provide so-called affordable units, but it is not available to low-income New Yorkers.
Tom, just hold it there. Tom, we have listeners who are not familiar with these terminologies nor these programs. So inclusionary zoning is very important for people to understand because it certainly has had impact here in Harlem. So step back a little bit and explain what inclusionary zoning is to our listeners.
Well, that's part of Mayor de Blasio's mandatory inclusionary housing and zoning. What that means is that these big developers are allowed to put aside zoning laws and build the much higher taller, larger buildings than the zoning laws call for, and in return, these as I said, these developers are supposed to include up to 30% of the units in these luxury buildings as affordable, but they're not affordable.
Why aren't
to
they
low-income,
affordable?
New Yorkers.
Why aren't they affordable, Tom?
Well, they're based upon the area
AMI?
median income, and the area median income in this city, and it also includes Westchester, includes people that make up to $100,000 a year. So they can get into these units, although there are relatively few available. But somebody making, say, under $30,000 a year is not eligible. So to me, the whole thing is just a big giveaway to the big real estate interests.
Yeah, let's just add, Tom, if we can add a caveat to this, is that in this this program of inclusionary zoning, the developer can agree to provide up to 30%, set aside 30% of the housing units for, quote, low income or moderate income folks. But these units can be off-site, or in one case here in New York that the New York City Council signed on to, they claim they didn't notice the fine print, is the pour door policy, whereas the developer will have separate entrance for the market rate tenants and those who are living in the set-aside units designated as affordable, and that's called the. Can you just talk a little bit more about that briefly before you move on to inclusionary zoning?
Well, that's very true what you said, and of course we can see these high-rise luxury buildings sprouting up all over the city, particularly here in Manhattan, but in other places as well. And for example, East New York, you just go over to Queens, and the place is full of these huge buildings. And this does not address. Of course, it does not address the real need of working class people for rents that are affordable to them. And of course, and then Mayor, and this is connected with Governor Cuomo's tax exemptions, 30 years. Up to 30 years of tax exemptions, $1 billion every year is being given to these developers.
Now, people are 41. Now, these are right. These are subsidies for our listeners. These are subsidies, and how many billions of dollars, Tom? Again. What was that figure that you mentioned?
It amounts to $1 billion a year.
$1 billion a year in tax
for these big developers.
Exemptions, which means tax subsidies. This is corporate welfare to the developers. Corporate welfare. Now think about $1 billion and what it could do to upgrade public housing, to build new housing, what some of us have called targeted income. It is, I would say, akin to what Councilman Charles Barron, not Councilman, I'm sorry, Assemblyman Charles Barron is doing in East New York. He talks about this all the time. If a developer comes into his district, his thing is, nope, you will build housing and ask for rents that are compatible with the incomes of my constituents. If you can't do that, goodbye, goodbye, goodbye. Now, why aren't these other politicians doing this? Could it be something about what is being passed under the table? Could that be it? But Tom, I just want to tell you, we have here in the studio with Samuel White Jr., who is a housing.
These politicians that approve this,
but
they get their campaign funded by. I mean, we know how closely connected De Blasio and Cuomo are to the real estate industry.
Exactly.
They get huge campaign funding from them.
Exactly.
And,
exactly. Tom, hold it a minute. Tom, excuse me, Tom. Hold it a minute. I have something to say here. Samuel White Jr., who is in the studio with us, and since we are talking about inclusionary zoning, we now want to focus on the development of the 125th Street strip commercial artery from west to east, and what is involved there. We're now seeing one of the first high-rise buildings that are going up on 125th. I think it's closer to Adam Clayton. It's closer to Fred Douglass. Sam, can you and Tom, I'm going to bring you on. Can we sort of focus on what is happening on the 125th Street strip? Because we know that Columbia University's $6 billion, that's billion, folks, not million, but $6 billion expansion into West Harlem will more than likely go all the way up to 168th Street, where its hospital is. But let's see if we can concentrate on 125th. Sam, could you talk about that briefly, and then Tom, you come in and talk about it as well.
I just know that it's growing darker on the street. You walk there on any afternoon. It's just darker, and then you don't see many of the.
I think you need to speak into the mic a little bit more. Your voice is far away, it seems.
Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm just saying that walking along that strip, it looks darker. You see that the fewer vendors are out there on the street. Working. You can't even see at one point, back in the days of Harlem Fight Back, you would go there and count the workers, and if there weren't enough people from even the neighborhood that were there, that was a cause to shut things down. But this fence and scaffolding, and it covers up things that are there, so you really can't get a vibe as to what's going on behind these fences, and it's locked down. There's not even a hole in the fence to look through to see the progress of the construction. They cover things up. Work goes on until you notice that behind it rises higher and higher and higher into the sky. There is the stores that are in the area. They're constantly being moved where one can just run in and buy small items. They are being removed, going further south and further north on the avenues.
Right, the small stores are being closed down, and the strip between Lenox Avenue and Adam Clayton Powell Boulevard, that would be on the north side of the street. Those small stores are now gone and closed, and what's going to be there is the Urban League Museum and offices and stuff like that, and these small businesses are gone. In the inclusionary zoning, Tom, that you talked about in the Bronx, along what's the commercial artery up there? It's a 30-block renovation up there that is just going to close down small business after small business. And we have the Small Business Association headed by Steve Knoll that has had a pending legislation in a committee in the New York City Council that has been there for a long time, because these local commercial businesses are looking for some relief, because the landlord can double and triple their rent, whatever they want, with the express purpose of driving them out. I can't think of but anyway, Tom, continue on this inclusionary zoning, in that it is, as one person has described, gentrification on steroids. So can you give us some concrete examples, including 125th?
Well, what's happening? What's happening on 25th Street already happened. Throughout many areas in Manhattan, and with all this, remember now that the people that are moving into these buildings, at least 70% of them are wealthy people paying high market rate rents. Now, the landlords that have stores, as you pointed out, they know that they want to cash in on this. So you have these, and you can see this all over the city, particularly in Manhattan, that these mom and pop stores are going out of business. I believe, according to the Small Business Association, 1,000 mom and pop stores are closing every month. And they hire people of color, working class people, and so this whole gentrification problem, and supported by the political establishment, is displacing communities of color, the working class from New York City, and where are they going to go? Where are they going to go?
Well, let's talk about, since we were on 125th Street, and Sam, please chime in. There was a Pathmark, as many of our listeners will remember, at the that would be the Lexington Avenue and 125th Street. That was on Lexington. That would be on the downtown side. That was a deal pulled together because there were a number of bodegas in that area, and there were many complaints, legitimately so, that those stores did not provide fresh fruits and vegetables and meats to the community, and that, in fact, Harlem and East Harlem in particular needed a supermarket, and a deal was forged with Pathmark, involving the New York City Department of Housing, HPD, the Abyssinian Development Corporation, and the East Harlem Triangle. Now, there have been some disputes about what happened, but the accusation that was against the Abyssinian Development Corporation, and in particular Reverend Calvin Butts, who was accused of allegedly selling out to Extel a very large development corporation. This was Extel who came up with the pour door solution for its luxury development, and that the East Harlem Triangle maintained that they knew nothing about the deal, and that it was negotiated by the Abyssinian Development Corporation to the exclusion of the city and the East Harlem Triangle. And that later on, as the matter developed, as issues came forth after the sale of the property to Extel, it was alleged again that the Abyssinian Development Corporation did not share equally the proceeds, and there were litigations behind that. Now, when you think of the community not having a full size supermarket selling all of these goods, and most of you, I'm sure, our listeners must have visited Pathmark. The issue was what would possess this leadership to sell out a supermarket. Now, remember, a number of bodegas went out of business. They went out of business.
There's supposed to be some deal arranged with the smaller businesses in that area that they were, as a group, were going to get some resources or something would be prepared for them while they allowed this supermarket to be built there. And it never seemed that they got their fair due. They almost disappeared from history at some point. They were a focus group trying to address the issue of what will happen to us when this supermarket is built, and then quietly they kind of disappeared. But then again, you had a group like East Harlem Triangle, who, good, bad, and different,
which is still around.
It's still around, but it comes from a different day. And I remember they were one of the
Alice Carnegie
was a part of the Harlem development group that was located on the west side, and she HD Harlem. It began at Columbia University's campus, actually, and Preston Wilcox, who's one of the original members, remember telling me that why are we talking about Harlem up here at Columbia University? We should be in the valley with the people. So they moved their original meeting site before it began. Actually, it's structured down to 125th Street between St. Nicholas, Frederick Douglass, near the post office. I can't think of the cross streets, but that's where it was throughout my memory of it. And that's where we saw it. And they became the development area. Marshall England was one of the members of it.
The late Marshall England.
Marshall England. Everyone seemed to have a piece of it. Preston Education, Marshall England, healthcare, Alice Carnegie Housing, Ennis had another piece to it. And and of course, it was a group of people who were community people. And I guess they were able to move fast enough to do kind of the more technology of it. And I know that even down to almost the present day, there was an effort made to, one of the gentlemen we talked to bring in Alice Carnegie and some of the people around her, family members, to bring them up to speed. All this is happening around you. You got to get up to speed, and you didn't quite get.
Yeah. Tom, let's get back to inclusionary zoning and some of the worst aspects of it. Now, inclusionary zoning met with stiff resistance from local groups, local community boards, local advocacy groups, local housing and business groups throughout across the boroughs. So let's talk about inclusionary zoning and where it is now, and maybe you can throw in how the mayor, I'll use this word as I have read it, allegedly bribed members of the New York City Council to vote for his inclusionary zoning program?
Well, as you just pointed out, the New York City Council approved inclusionary zoning, and so did. I don't hear any opposition from certain tenant groups that have been around for a long time and who get funding from Democratic politicians about what we're talking about. So, however, certain grassroots groups, they are mounting opposition, growing opposition to this gentrification, and the Rent Control Committee has joined a group called the Tenant Action Network, and we're putting out a very simple solution. That is, no renter, regardless of his or her income, regardless of his or her rental status, should pay no more than a third of their net incomes toward rent.
Right. This is,
and the landlords, even at that the landlords will still make a profit, not the huge profits that they're making now, but they will still make a decent profit, and that's a very simple solution, but it's something that you can be assured that these phony political establishment, these politicians will never consider. And so, getting back to the recent rent reform laws.
Well, Tom, we are going to have Tom.
Do not address
excuse me, Tom. We are going to have to end the program shortly because our time is coming to an end, but we will continue this discussion, hopefully with both you and Samuel White Jr. And I want to add this announcement. I want to talk about this announcement apropos of what you have said, Tom, is that the Tenant Action Committee is holding a housing conference on October 26th at St. Mary's Church. That is an activist church. And the time is, and we do have newspapers, and we're going to leave some of the newspapers here at Grant. And the time is, I wish this was a bit more clear in terms of the information. Tom, can you give us the details on the housing conference? Tom, can you give us the details on the housing conference?
Well, as you pointed out, the Tenant Action Network, TAN, they're going to hold
since Tom and I are
to
members.
Discuss all of these problems at St. Mary's Church. What was the
Tom, what time
date?
is it?
What?
October 26th. Tom, if you could give us, Tom, if you could give us the time and address of St. Mary's Church. Do you have that in front of you?
I believe it's going to begin at 4:00, but I don't have that in front of me right now. But you can call me at 646-457-8367, 646-457-8367, or send me an email, Tom Syracuse.
Tom, I think we have an Tom, we have an address for the Tenant Action Network, and I think it would be appropriate to have that email address. But you know what, Tom, excuse me, excuse me, Tom.
Tenant Action Network at gmail.com.
Right. Okay, Tenant Action Network at gmail.com. That would be
Yes.
the appropriate email address. So we want to thank everyone and our guest here, Tom Syracuse, on the line, and here in the studio with us, Samuel White Jr., housing advocate here in Harlem. We will continue this, hopefully, part 2 in the coming weeks. And we want to thank all of our listeners for tuning in to ghcr.nyc. And again, that is ghcr.nyc. And this has been Behind the News for Liberation and Political Consciousness. I'm your host and producer, Nellie Hester Bailey, and we thank all of you for tuning in with us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Doug, we're off the air. Yeah. 2 o'clock.
Still on the air. People can hear you and Sam. We're still live on our YouTube channel. People can still hear you and Samuel Wright Jr., worldwide prognosticator, indicator. He's the Little Richard of housing. Motivator, stimulator. So anyway, this is on our live YouTube channel. When you go home today, Sam, if you go to YouTube and type in Live at Grant, and you will see yourself.
Oh my goodness.
That's what you'll see.
Oh my goodness. I'll invite everybody. Thank you, brother.
Hey, Doug, is that your coffee on the table, man?
Take that coffee off the table before we say please. Now violate my own rules. Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Rick.
We don't do
Thank you,
coffee
Rick.
on the table, man.
Thank you, Rick.